Hello and welcome to our very first video series we're calling the Western Caucus Chairman's Chat. So today my guest is my good friend from the great state of Wyoming, Liz Cheney. Thank you, Liz, for joining us.
Great to be with you. Great to help you kick it off.
Well, good. Anxious to talk about a very important issue today, and that's, as you may or may not know, this is Endangered Species Week, and today we're going to focus on one of the apex animals in our country, the grizzly bear. And so thank you for joining us and talking about something that's so important to both of our states.
Yep.
Washington State, the grizzly bears are a huge issue, and I think they also
are in Wyoming. Yes.
In Wyoming.
Yeah.
But to focus just a little bit on the Endangered Species Act, it truly is a landmark piece of legislation that was signed into law nearly 50 years ago by President Nixon, as a matter of fact. And over time, it has accomplished some good things. However, if you really are looking at successes, it's really hard to call the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, anything but a failure. Because you know why I can say that, Liz? No more than 3% of the endangered species that have been added to this list over that period of almost 50 years have come off the list. Yeah. And so if we're talking about trying to improve a species, that's a pretty dismal record. And in anybody's mind.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly.
So we want to talk about not only the grizzly bear, but also some of the things that maybe could help that, improve our record, and compare a little bit this administration to the previous administration in how they approach that. So I'm really excited that you're here to talk about grizzly bears, the ESA, and help us launch our very first Chairman's Chat. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Great to be here with you, and great to have the chance to talk about this really important issue. And as you pointed out, the Endangered Species Act was, I think the intention was certainly a good one. We all want to make sure we're doing everything we can to help to make sure that species that are threatened can be protected. But its implementation has been frankly terrible. And my colleague from Wyoming over on the Senate side, John Barrasso, compares the recovery rate for the Endangered Species Act with what it would look like if a physician had that kind of a record.
Interesting.
If you went in and only had 3% of your patients survive, it would not be a good record. So I think when you look at the ESA, it's something we've been focused on for a long time. It's something that we think needs very significant reform. Some of the things we've looked at are prohibiting the listing of multiple species all at once. Really making sure that it can be much more targeted and focused. But these are issues that affect, our constituents in every industry, certainly in our ag industry, our energy industry in Wyoming. But it's important that this bill not be allowed to continue to sort of overtake this legislation, this law, not be allowed to overtake, people's ability to make a living, people's ability to thrive.
You're exactly right. I'm glad you brought that up. But not only are we focused on the species themselves and helping them to recover, that's our goal. That's what we want. That was the intention of the ESA. But we've also, I think, what our intention is to lift up the voices of those local communities who have been negatively impacted by some of the regulations that have been forced on their communities because of the ESA. So look at it this way: if we're not helping the species, and at the same time we're negatively impacting industries and communities. Yeah. I think it's really time to refocus and ask ourselves, okay, how can we do this better? Yeah. And so that's one of the goals here in our video series, is to help raise those voices of the local communities, let them have some input in how we can really be better at something that's so important to our country.
Yeah, and I think that is true across the board, whether you're talking about ESA, For us in Wyoming, obviously issues that are connected to land use management and federal oversight, control, ownership of our lands. The solutions all have in common the importance of getting local stakeholders at the table and helping to make those decisions. So
right.
It's really, and when you look at the ESA and you look at the species that we've dealt with in Wyoming, the wolf and the grizzly, we've shown that we know how best to manage those species. That in our state, the grizzly is fully recovered and should be delisted. But it's clear that the federal government needs, a real push to do that, needs Congress apparently to legislate.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We do have some successes we could point to, the gray wolf being one, the grizzly bear being another. And we're very reluctant to claim victory and celebrate the successes of the ESA. That's a great segue into some of the questions I think that we want to try to answer today. So what can we do to improve the Endangered Species Act? Well, if we look at the Trump administration, they actually accomplished a couple of things that are pretty important. Number one, and I think this is just like we were talking about, providing ways for local communities, local governments, even tribes to have more say, to have more impact in the decisions that are being made. Critical, wouldn't you say?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, I think it also requires additional oversight from Congress and probably new legislation so that some of the requirements, for example, if you look at what's happened with the grizzly, each time in Wyoming, we got close to accomplishing, what we had been told were the goals and the objectives in order to get the grizzly delisted, the federal government moves the goalposts. And so I think you've got a situation where some of the environmentalist groups clearly have tried to use the act by doing things like listing multiple species at a time in ways it wasn't intended, and ignoring the cost of the act to our local stakeholders. So I think there are a lot of really interesting approaches that have been suggested that we ought to pursue and get back as much as we can to local control.
Yeah, like you said, it's really been used as a tool, as a weaponized tool to stop a lot of things that some people may consider to be bad, like utilizing some of our resources. So they use the ESA or some species that is perceived to be endangered. Add that to the list and never take it off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just this kind of, rather than say, listen, let's let the states be laboratories for what works. If states are managing these species well, let's let that go and let's let them do it. They know best how to do it. That's not the approach we saw in the Obama administration. It's certainly not the approach that we're seeing now in the Biden administration.
And you mentioned the economic impacts. That was one, I think, very positive change that the Trump administration added, was not to make economic considerations a determining factor, but they should be considered in making these decisions. And it looks as though the Biden administration is just going to take all that out. No consideration whatsoever for the economic impact to our local communities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, what we see when we go down that path is a burden on our local communities, a burden on our local industry, a burden on the people that actually depend upon the land, depend upon the resources for their livelihood, and they end up being restricted from being able to access those things because of ESA rules and regulations that are set 2,000 miles away.
You're exactly right. We need partners on the ground, the landowners, the businesses, the local communities. And one of the aspects of what the Biden administration is doing, they're treating endangered and threatened as exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. And in order for this to work, what we've seen in the past and what the Trump administration did, they as species improve and recover, they are moved from endangered to a threatened classification. And at that time, then some of the restrictions are lifted or eased, which really provides an incentive for all of our partners to want to help the process move forward.
Right.
That's a very positive thing if they see an improvement not only to the species but to the things that they're able to do.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a very negative. It's a step backward as far as I'm concerned.
It is, and we're seeing it, frankly, across the board. If you look at something now like sage grouse, which has not been listed, we in Wyoming have had a really effective state management plan. Across the West, we've seen effective state management plans that really have worked to increase the numbers. But still, you've got this looming threat of the federal government coming in and saying, we're going to ignore all the work you've done and all the money you've spent, tens of millions of dollars in many cases, and list the species, even though we see that it's been recovered and that things are going well. So there's a real disconnect between the DC bureaucrats and what's actually happening, out on the ground.
So Liz, you've been very engaged in this issue. You've come from a state that this is very important. And I know you've got some legislation pending. I'd like to give you a chance to talk about that just a little bit.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I've introduced legislation to require the delisting of the grizzly, to recognize that the grizzly has been recovered. We need to recognize that. And we also need to recognize that citizens of Wyoming, the citizens across the West, where grizzlies inhabit, need to be able to manage those, need to be able to take action, for example, to protect their livestock, to protect themselves. And I think that the restrictions that exist because the species has not been delisted prevent that. And it's a place where, as you said, we ought to be celebrating the success and able to get species off the list as they recover.
Or we won't have those partners that we need to make all this happen.
Right.
Landowners, businesses, communities are going to be very reluctant to acknowledge that a species is threatened because of the negative impacts that will bring onto them, which is counterproductive.
Right.
Truly is.
It is. And we also ought to be able to take action to prevent some of the abuses of our legal system that we continue to see from the far left. And we see it with respect to the Endangered Species Act. We see it on NEPA across the board. There are just a whole range of areas where, in addition to saying we want to delist the grizzly, my legislation also prevents further judicial review of the decision. Basically says it's done, it's delisted, it's a success. Let's focus our resources on areas that we need to focus on.
Right, because there's a lot of ground to cover here.
Right.
A lot of species that need our attention.
Exactly.
And limited amounts of resources to do this.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your
you.
engagement in this issue. It's really important. As I said, our stated goal is to raise up local voices, and you're contributing tremendously to that. And I think that's so important to make the ESA actually work as it was intended, to help those species that truly are endangered, and also to allow our communities to thrive. So thank you very much for helping us kick off our Western Caucus Chairman's Chat. This has been very interesting, and I look forward to continuing your work and to work with you on this issue.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for your tremendous leadership across the board on these issues, and thanks for having me today.
Great. Thank you.